The Honorable Justices of the Supreme Court, hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons having business before this court are admonished to draw nigh and give their attention to the court, now sitting.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll now turn to the calling of the docket. Call the first case, which is case number 1048. Kansas became a state in 1861. We've had a Supreme Court that entire time. It took 150 years for the Supreme Court to actually leave its own courtroom. We went to the State House across the street and we heard oral arguments in 4 cases, primarily so that the legislators who were then in session could just walk across the hallway and see who we are and what we do and how we do it. That was well received, and so we made a small road trip, if you will, to my hometown of Salina that April, and we heard 4 cases argued that morning in the Saline County Courthouse. Our trip today to Johnson County is our 5th trip outside of our Supreme Court courtroom. This is the first time, I believe, when we've actually sat at an educational institution. So students should not have any excuse on why they could not come in and listen if they had an interest. We have district courts in Kansas, which are otherwise known as the trial courts, where you would have a jury, where you would have actual exhibits introduced, you would have witnesses sworn in to tell the truth, and then a judge presiding over the trial. If there is a result in that case, i.e. a verdict, that one party to the lawsuit does not like, then that party has an absolute right to appeal one time to the Kansas Court of Appeals, which is our intermediate appellate court. Let's say one party is dissatisfied with the Court of Appeals decision, and then they can file what's called a petition for review with the Supreme Court, and then we review that document and determine whether that case is something that we want to listen to. If we say it is not, then that case is over. If it is something we do want to grant review on, then the attorneys will make their oral arguments to us. We will read the briefs that they have prepared. At our level, we do not have a jury. We do not have a witness who is sworn in telling the truth. What we have instead is something called the record on appeal. So instead of having the live witness testimony, we have a transcript of what the witness testified to at the district court level. After a decision has been reached by the Kansas Supreme Court, there is the opportunity to file what's called a petition for a writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. They will get about 10,000 requests a year, and they will grant less than 100. So basically, once a decision has been rendered by the Kansas Supreme Court for something happening in Kansas, that is the final disposition of that case.
Every year I have about 25 oral arguments in the Kansas Court of Appeals. They sit in panels of 3 judges. About 4 times a year I will have an oral argument in the Kansas Supreme Court. I had the 3rd case. Each side was allowed 15 minutes to present its oral arguments. A lot of that time is spent answering questions that the court may have concerning the facts or the law. Ideally, the attorneys try to make some points that they'd like that were in the brief that they'd like to stress to the court. Sometimes you don't always have time to get those points out because of the questions from the court, but the intent is to help the court arrive at its decision by answering questions concerning facts or cases or explaining the law. I think the basic preparation for oral arguments in the Kansas Supreme Court is the same as for the Court of Appeals. However, since there are 7 judges instead of 3 judges, you're more aware that you need to be really prepared because you might get 7 questions from 7 different people instead of 3 different people. So the procedure as far as reading the briefs, reading the cases, updating your research is the same, but it's just at a higher level, I think, when you appear in front of the Kansas Supreme Court. I feel very honored to be able to argue cases in the Kansas Supreme Court and the Kansas Court of Appeals, that the district attorney trusts me in my judgment and ability to write briefs and argue the cases orally in front of the court. So I feel fortunate to have that, and I have loved this job ever since I started doing it.
I arrived there at about 8 o'clock, and the proceedings started at 9. I was at the very end of a very long line, and I ended up waiting, and they were trying to push us off into this other room, you know, where we could watch it on television, but I wasn't going for that. So I went ahead and waited about an hour, and they finally let us in, and I was lucky enough to be one of the last few people that were actually allowed into the Craig Auditorium.
I'm very interested in getting into being a litigation paralegal. I'd love to be a trial assistant. I think that sounds very interesting. And when I had heard that the Supreme Court was going to be on campus, I actually went to my boss and asked for a time off. I put a vacation time in for it so I could have the whole day. Didn't want to just take a half day. I actually took the entire day off and went, observed everything, and just tried to absorb what I'd seen and really appreciate what I'd gotten a chance to participate in.
I have an interest in going to law school. I'm hoping sooner rather than later. My major interests are environmental and energy law. I'd love to work for a legislature, kind of advising them as to how to write those kind of laws. It's a huge controversy in America, what those laws should look like and if they should even exist. Those laws that are created, those statutes that are created in the legislature are actually, interpreted by the courts. So they're a huge part of the process, even though you don't necessarily think of a court as writing laws. They do interpret the law, which is, a big part of the process, and one reason why I really wanted to, see the oral proceedings, because those are the kind of issues that they would cover. That's what they would talk about, is statutes and how they should be interpreted.
This is the first time that I've ever been to a judicial proceeding, and it was fascinating. The reference that I have is what I've watched on television, and seeing it in person, it's eye-opening. The oral arguments that are being presented by the attorneys to the justices, they're holding the fate of someone in their hands. Depending on how well or how poorly those arguments are presented will determine whether or not that person either wins or loses their appeal, and whether or not they'll continue to stay in jail or whether they won't.
What I got the most out of it is the same thing that I get out of reading a lot of trial decisions. The court is actually very open-minded, that it is not a robot, that it takes individual situations and the good of the people into account when deciding matters.
You expect the Supreme Court justices to be very formal, to be very stiff, to be detached and unemotional, and they were not like that. I liked the High Court's sense of humor. That was surprising. You don't expect to see justices, be relaxed and have a sense of humor during a proceeding.
Already, and they're able to make those distinctions.
Counsel, just so, sorry to interrupt the interruptions. Just so I'm clear, are you...
At any time the drugs aren't on on the person, or drugs, or whatever the evidence is that's seized, that we have at least the potential to call it constructive, particularly when it's in a public place, or at least a place to which the public might have access.
Correct. I will concede that in this case the drugs aren't on the defendant is on the drugs. Okay. And but I think you could factor that in.
I'm interested in how the law can be different than it's interpreted by the judiciary.
To be careful here, with all due respect, judges are wrong sometimes. If there are no further questions.
Any judges you care to identify?
No, sir.
Any further questions of counsel? Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
I think it was very nice for the Supreme Court to share the proceedings with us and have it on campus. I think it not only shows their respect for us as a learning institution, it also really shows they know that Johnson County Community College really turns out quality paralegals. They know that we are an asset to the Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri legal field.